So we are, of course, the Panopticon group. You can see our title is The View from the Panopticon Youth Drug Abuse in Scotland. I am Marshall. We have Corey, Matt, Colleen, and Alex all presenting for you today. So the general synopsis of the Panopticon is a young woman, about 15 years old, is put in a secure foster home, which is the Panopticon, for allegedly attacking a police officer. Throughout the novel, she shares her experiences in both the Panopticon, what leads up to it, and the immediate following of her experiences there. Much like her, her companions are addicted to drugs. This is the entire variety of both legal medication, illegal drugs, illicit drug use, everything spanning the entire spectrum of drug use. And then questions of whether or not she is guilty permeates the novel. We learn maybe she not be, maybe she is, she may realize it as we go along. She questions her utter existence, whether or not she was born on Earth. There's an experience that created her in a test tube, and her future, what it means for Aeneas, the main character's name, to exist in going forward in life. Just a quick overview of the characters that we will discuss and that are pretty premier in the novel. Aeneas, again, 15 years old, that main protagonist. We have Officer Craig, the assaulted officer, again, alleged by Aeneas. We find out later on, pretty believably, that Aeneas may not, in fact, be responsible for her critical condition. Tosh and Isla are both a young couple who befriend Aeneas while in the Panopticon, one of which is a prostitute, which becomes a pretty central theme throughout the later periods of the novel. There's also Shorty, another resident, another female right at Aeneas' age, who she becomes very close with, arguably her best friend throughout. Jay, Aeneas' ex-boyfriend, is in prison for dealing drugs. He is kind of a central antagonist, kind of subtly throughout the entire novel as well. Angus is Aeneas' caseworker for the majority of. There are a collection of other Panopticon residents as well throughout, as well as previous friends, acquaintances, and other people we meet along the way. Some quick context and background for you guys. Author Jenny Fagan did spend time in foster care. From an NPR interview, we hear that she actually spent 16 years in the Scottish foster care system, so she's very, very familiar, maybe not an expert, but I mean very, very familiar with what it means to be in this kind of facility. It takes place in a present-day Western Scotland, UK, which becomes important if you're familiar with kind of the breakdown of the United Kingdom as a whole, as well as Great Britain, region, counter-regionalities, things along those lines. Deals with foster care system and drug use, as we touched on. The foster home is inside of the Panopticon as well. Talking about Scotland, you can kind of see this. We have the greater UK. Glasgow, some people are fairly familiar with. If you're thinking of kind of the London, England, that's going to be much more southern. We're talking about the northern and then western part. There are a lot of lochs mentioned, a lot of waterways, a lot of rivers, kind of a much more rainy, forested area, which takes place on the northwestern areas of Scotland. Here's an example of Panopticon, just so you can kind of realize, as you read through the novel, it's difficult to kind of picture what this means. It's a big open area. There's the center watchtower that the experiment is or may not be hiding inside. As you can see, these are all cells for individual people. It's all opened up, so when you're in your cell, no one can see you except what this center tower can see into your room. Maybe a more modern representation of what a Panopticon would look like would be the Hunger Games. Kind of an easy way for you to realize this is a scene from when they're inside looking at that initial dome. You can kind of get that feel of being inside and being watched, having this ever-present eye around you.
So some of the themes that we look at in the Panopticon are drug abuse, the foster system, sexual abuse, freedom, this idea of law enforcement, identity and youth, and then kind of this idea of escaping one's own fate. Aeneas struggles a lot with all of these issues. We're only going to focus on a few of them for you today. So looking at all of these themes and what we know about the Panopticon, and then what we're able to learn through further research into some of these themes, our thesis is that though a work of fiction, Fagan's novel provides an accurate and moving social commentary on the extent of the problem of drug abuse among teenagers in Scotland, as well as highlighting many of the underlying causes and government responses associated with this drug use. And something that we wanted to talk a little bit about was why we can use the Panopticon to kind of look at these real-world issues in the first place. And it's actually helpful to understand that there's a precedent for using these works of fiction to view societies. And there are a lot of studies that look at drug use and how it's portrayed by literature over time. because it is one of the best representations to show social attitudes, to show the current tone, the current climate of a given society surrounding drug use. So studies show the transition in literature from this 60s counterculture drug use to kind of the drug user as a criminal, to then more modern applications of kind of this drug user as everyman, the drug user as the protagonist, someone that you want to root for, and that's definitely what we see here with Aeneas. So using that kind of literature as a mirror of a culture, and looking at Scottish literature, it's actually been the focus of a lot of modern literary analysis and a lot of discussion recently to kind of analyze this modern identity crisis that's going on in Scotland as a whole. They say, you know, a psychologist analyzes a person, so we're better to analyze a country than its literature. And they kind of talk about this Scottish narrative as big dreams followed by catastrophic failure, caused by this big dream being completely unrealistic. And another place we see this is a novel and a film called Train Spotting. And they actually say that this is, you know, Scotland's favorite story because of this Scottish identity crisis that it represents. There's actually a popular Scottish author who recently wrote a piece for The Guardian about how Scottish literature almost portrays Scotland as a country you know, plagued by mental illness, that the country as a whole has this borderline personality disorder kind of caused by this identity crisis. And so it's kind of this idea of feeling trapped, seeking escape, the hope of a fresh start, and they call that the classic idealism before the fall that's associated with Scotland and with mental illness. So in looking at that and using literature as a lens to look at these modern issues, we're going to talk to you a little bit today about the scope of drug use in Scotland, about drugs and sexual assault and drugs in the foster care system, so some of the underlying causes, about social attitudes toward drug use, government responses in terms of law enforcement, in terms of prevention, and then we're going to do a little meta-analysis of those things for you.
So the first thing that we're going to talk about is kind of drugs in general, just how they're prevalent they are in Scotland, and then also how prevalent they are amongst adolescents, which is the primary age group of the characters in the Panopticon. So kind of to start off with, we wanted to do drugs by the numbers, just to get an idea of how big of a problem drugs are in Scotland. So first, there's statistics for consumption. So who is actually taking these drugs? Well, what we found was that 10 to 20% of adolescents in Scotland are smoking, and whereas 30 to 90% of them in Scotland are drinking as a regular use. 10% have moderate drinking, so the average for women is 1 drink a day, whereas men it's 2 drinks a day. So moderate drinking is above that, but not really binge drinking all the time. And then illicit drugs is about 70%, so that includes not just alcohol, but like heroin and cocaine and acid, which is very prevalent in the Panopticon. And then weekly users is about 2.5% of these illicit drugs. So we definitely see this among the characters in the Panopticon. They're constantly talking about the acid they're doing, or the marijuana they're smoking, or the cigarettes that they're smoking. So it's definitely a very big issue in the book. So the average age for drug users is, to start, is about 11 to 12 years old. So that was the articles that I read were those who start using it are between 11 and 12 years old, whereas for alcohol consumption it's between 13 and 14 years old, and then the average age to start smoking cigarettes is 12 years old. So drugs in adolescence kind of continued. The younger that someone will start using these drugs or alcohol or illicit drugs, the more likely they are to be a lifelong user. So if you kind of start very young, the chances of you staying a lifelong user greatly increased. The use of cannabis or marijuana is definitely linked to illicit drugs, so it's kind of that word gateway drug. When you start using cannabis at first, it kind of translates you into using more illicit drugs. One thing that I did find is that adolescents in Scotland are less likely to use heroin as in comparison to marijuana or alcohol. And then adolescents are very susceptible to social factors, which we'll get into a little bit in more detail later, but this is kind of, it's a social thing to do, whereas like in the Panopticon we can see a lot of the characters do it together, and they do it when they are together. So some causative factors which I found pretty interesting was that Users that are between the ages of 15 and 18 years old are most likely to start using drugs or alcohol because of the low socioeconomic or educational opportunities afforded to them, which is definitely something that we see with Aeneas and her friends in the Panopticon, is that this is right in their age group. Aeneas is 15 throughout the majority of the book, besides the times that she flashes back to younger ages. So you can definitely see that she is of low socioeconomic status. She doesn't have a lot of educational opportunities afforded to her, so it's definitely very interesting that we found research to back this up. A lot of what happens in the school, like I was saying, low educational opportunities is related to drug use and when they start using drugs. Social life is a big thing, like I mentioned before. Your social gatherings, drug use is very prevalent. Some personalities are more prone to be using certain drugs. So a lot of the personalities that we see in the Panopticon are very radical behaviors. So that's definitely a factor towards if you will use drugs or alcohol. And then socioeconomic status is what I kind of already touched on a little bit. And then just to kind of compare drugs or adolescent to adulthood, there is a switch in the causative factors of using drugs. So users that are 18 to 23 years old, which is kind of the next bracket, they are more likely to start using drugs because of their higher socioeconomic status. So what is very interesting is that the younger you are, the more likely your drug use is to be related to your low socioeconomic status, whereas as you get older, it kind of flip-flops. And then drug-related deaths increase 1.05 times per year you get older. So the older you are, the more likely you are to die of like an overdose, which I thought was extremely interesting. And then women are much more prone to dying because of drug use. They're about 2.5 times greater in comparison to men. And then, as was mentioned earlier, there's a closer relationship to socioeconomic status, and the higher socioeconomic status you are, the more likely you are to start using drugs as you get older.
So one of the big underlying factors that is very prevalent in the Panopticon and that is important to look at when talking about youth drug abuse in general is sexual abuse. So to understand the scope of the problem of drug abuse among the youth, it's really important to know that drug use is often either predicated or exacerbated by sexual assault, particularly in youth. So oftentimes drug use is sparked by an incident of sexual abuse or sexual assault, or is exacerbated or made much worse by this assault. So it's kind of a way of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder from the incident, numbing the pain of the incident. And you can kind of see some statistics here of the role that drugs play in cases of sexual assault, so in continuing this cycle. So not only is it a symptom of, is drug use a symptom of sexual abuse, but it's also something that can be predicated by it. So there's kind of this self-fulfilling cycle that we need to look at. And there's a lot less focus on abuse in the foster care system in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. So there's a lot less research going on, a lot less accountability for foster care systems in Scotland than elsewhere. Currently, there is a major sexual abuse campaign going on in Scotland. It's called the We Can Stop It campaign, and this is based on the Sexual Offences Act of 2009. So these are just a few images from that campaign. But this campaign is completely absent from the foster care system. This is something that isn't part of the dialogue, isn't part of the resources that these children have access to. So it really perpetuates this cycle of abuse, both sexual and then with drugs.
Alright, so I'm going to talk about the foster care system and drugs in the foster care system, which, as we talked about, is a huge part of Panopticon because Panopticon is basically a foster home, and as we've stated, Aeneas is always on drugs. So, in Scotland, most of the foster care children go through local authorities to be placed within the foster care system, and it's through an agency called Care Inspectorate. And what they do is there's a website for them, and you can go to them or to the local authorities, and they'll refer you to them, and you can sign up to become a foster carer. And they regulate over 14,000 care services, from childminders to care homes, and they also try to give regular checkups on the caregivers to make sure that everything at the home or wherever they're like staying is up to par on their standards, and if they're not, they'll do their best to help them improve them, and if they can't improve it, then they take the foster children away from them. And another part, the Scottish government sets a fostering allowance, so they have specifically stated whether they can give them like a certain amount, like how low it can be or how high it can be, and then the local authorities decide for specific children how high or how low that's going to be within those parameters the Scottish government set. And it's based on the child's age, so if they're younger, they might need more money to take care of them. If they're older, they might need less. And then the needs of the child, so if they're disabled, if they have some sort of sickness, they might need more money. So, all right. So there is also for foster caregivers in Scotland. There's also a website called Foster Line Scotland, and it's a helpline for like foster caregivers to help the foster carers if they have any questions, like financial questions, like questions about taking care of the child, like what do I do when the child does this, what do I do when the child does that, if they have questions about what do I do when the child's about to leave, like my care and things like that. Also, they help them with legislation changes and financial matters, so if they need help paying more for the child or are not able to pay as much. And then they also help them with allegations and complaints. Alright, so one thing about the foster care system is once you get in, you're not always staying at one place. So you could be moving from one place to another in a home, like a specific caregiver. And what I was able to find was that about 20% of all changes are behavior related. So when I found this, I was a little surprised because just thinking what I know about the foster care system, you would think it would be a lot more for behavior related. Like their attitudes just aren't, and what they're doing, like the foster caregivers can't handle it, but it's actually a lot lower. Most of it actually comes from, about 70%, comes from system and policy mandates. So different changes, not allowing the caregiver to hold on to the child, or the foster home to not hold on to as many or certain children in that. But information so far on movement within the foster care system is a bit limited. I found a couple sources from Scotland, some from the U.S., but it's not as prevalent as it could be. It's kind of a little bit of newer data. So, and then one interesting thing I found was that 29% of the foster children that go into foster care, they go into only short-term facilities, which is pretty interesting because that means that they go in under the guise that they're going to go back to their family if they have one. So, because sometimes children are taken from their parents if they can't, if they're not doing a good job and things like that, and they have to be taken away. If it's only for a short time, but that still does mean that 70% are still stuck in the foster care system for a long time. So in Scotland, about a third of children referred under foster care still haven't been placed after 6 weeks. So that's kind of an interesting fact. I found that it's unfortunate that there's not enough foster caregivers to immediately just say, okay, we've got a place for you, or something like that. But the fostering service is divided between two types basically. There's the child care social work teams, which is kind of like what we see in the Panopticon, where it's a team of people where we have Angus and everyone who tries to help out. It's not just where we see in Panopticon the book, not the actual Panopticon part in the book, where Anais is with Teresa, which would basically more be a family placement, not exactly a family placement worker. But an interesting thing about it is that these social workers were reported by people within the foster care system that they weren't as good at taking care of the foster care children, or as good at knowledge about foster care and everything, which was pretty interesting because in the Panopticon we noticed that most of the people taking care of the children aren't doing a very good job, and they start to not care. And then we have there's only one of them, which is Angus, who really keeps rooting for them and trying to help out. So it makes a little bit of sense there. Alright, so drugs are very prevalent within the foster care system, and so one thing I found was a study that showed that when people are leaving the foster care system, the chance that they're going to continue doing drugs or start doing drugs is very high, and it's thought of because that there isn't any there's nothing in place for when they leave to stop them. There's no intervention process, nothing. They're not really given people to contact or stuff like that. It's really they go out kind of on their own, so they end up being dependent on drugs because of the problems they had in the foster care system, and because there's no intervention process to stop them or help them out. So one of the articles I read was talking about how that can be a very important process to get going, to give these children something to go back to, or even if they were told which they probably are to the caregivers they were just with, to go back to them to ask them for help and things. And another interesting statistic was that children exiting the foster care system who didn't know their birth parents were more likely to do drugs than children who didn't know their parents, and the same goes for when they're in the foster care system. If they didn't know their parents, they were also more likely to do drugs. Another reason for a speculative...
Keep going.
Okay. Speculated reason for them continuing to do drugs in the foster care system is because the quality of the foster care system isn't too great all the time. Like I said, it's about a third of the children in Scotland aren't placed right away. It takes about 6 weeks because things like policies and paperwork, and then the fact that they don't have a lot of caregivers. So, and I found that 7% of the caregivers are lost annually in 96, 97. What I found is the rate has stayed about the same, so about 7% leave a year, and about 6%, which is really high for the percent that leaves, is usually new caregivers. So, and then sorry, I lost my place for a second. But one thing that I looked into was them getting drugs, and an interesting thing was that a lot of times they can get them in legal ways because doctors are very adamant about giving children in foster care system drugs to help with behavioral problems. And the 3 top used drugs that doctors would give away were let's see here, risperidol, Seroquel, and Zyprexa, which are all schizophrenic drugs, so they help with schizophrenia, and they were prescribing them to these children for behavioral problems. And on that, it's not for behavioral problems, which is one problem, and then they're described as giving them cocktails of drugs, and it was about, I wrote my wrong statistic, it was about 2% of foster care kids were only taking one med, which isn't too bad, but then about 9.2% were taking more than one medication, which, when you think about all the children that are in foster care, that's quite a lot.
So we talk a lot about drug use. It's important to look at drugs in society, the social perceptions of drug use, not within foster care systems, but also outside of it, and the social kind of ramifications around that. We see that women face more social stigma than men, for a variety of reasons, as you can imagine. It's fairly similar to the U.S. systems in that women are just held to different standards than men. This is especially for women during pregnancy. Interestingly enough, women, when in pregnancy, seek out treatment less often because they're afraid of the social stigma of being pregnant and being a drug user, instead of trying to kick the habit, so to speak, while with child. Youth, collective conditions. A lot of youth, when using drugs, find other drug users and develop an us versus them mentality. We use drugs, it's not that bad, or we use drugs because we're poor, or any number of reasons, and they unite under this cause. So they create a culture of drug use that's okay because they use it together, and they use it for one collective purpose as well. And that's just speaking to the marginalized populations of both youth of low socioeconomic status. There's a lot of evidence supporting that homosexual populations use drug use more because of the inherent stressors that come along with that, sadly, in today's age. Just important, looking at attitudes over time. Right now there is a Know the Score campaign. This is similar to the DARE campaign that came out in the United States a little over a decade ago. This just looks to say, understand drug use, understand there is help out there for students. Again, youth drug culture is kind of simultaneously condemned and endorsed by both the government and pop culture. You see this a lot in the United States. There is a lot of glamour around drug use with celebrities and on pop culture shows and in movies and things like that. That's very prevalent in Scotland as well. They have a kind of a looser FCC, so to speak, in what can make it out on the airways and things like that. Programs are less effective because youth respect of the drug culture. Again, kind of that us versus them. They respect it. We are in a drug culture with together. I'm not going to abandon my friends. This is the niche that I found for myself. And older teens are an exemplar for younger teens. So a lot of programs are designed at helping younger teens where there's a lot of evidence support that actually the older teens should be targeted because they're going to help younger teens stop using drugs as well. Interestingly enough, there's some evidence out there right now that Western philosophy kind of endorses drug use, and that being methamphetamine use. If you're unfamiliar, methamphetamines are kind of the uppers, the drugs that help you focus. The Ritalin, obviously, kind of ADD drugs taken recreationally. That's because there's social pressure, social expectation for you to succeed, for you to do well. You're in a private liberal arts school. You're here to go to graduate school, you go to med school and go forward. Those pressures are also felt by other youth, and they feel this need to succeed. There's a young girl who's interviewed. She said, I use Ritalin essentially because I want the corner office, and that's what's going to put me ahead. That's what's going to help me to get ahead in the game. And that's a lot of social pressure, as you can see, coming from that, coming from the need to succeed and that stress to succeed in situations, especially within foster care. These students or these children don't want to be in foster care. They want to be out and they want to be successful, which is part of the reason that people think that drug use is so rampant. Quickly just go over drug laws. We talk a lot about drug laws. You should just be remotely familiar with them. They have 3 different scales of drugs, Class A, B, and C, lowering in severity. Class A drugs being kind of drugs that have no beneficial value for anyone whatsoever, that being crack cocaine, ecstasy, LSD, mushrooms, meth, things like that, that there's just really no understood medical help for. Class B are kind of those middle range where there's definitely some medical evidence that's going to support it, but it may not be the best drug for people to take. This includes cannabis, Ritalin, amphetamines, things we were just talking about, and kind of those uppers. And then Class C are drugs that are typically agreed upon as medically okay. These are anabolic, metabolic steroids, ketamine, parapsamines. All of these do have their dangers inherent, but they're kind of agreed that they are medically sound. They also have a unique temporary banning order. The Scottish government can temporarily ban completely something for 1 year, and that is to kind of get it off the streets so they can kind of study the medical. This happened recently when there was kind of the bath salts 2 years ago. Scotland came out, banned it straight up for 1 year, and then later filed it as a Class A drug because there's really no medical importance to that. And then, just kind of going along with the youth protocol, there's no hard and fast rulings. Scotland kind of operates case by case, very specifically in that, they look at a lot of varying things, including class, quantity of drug, where the user was even found, your personal history. In kind of our case of Panopticon MW has a very extensive history. I think we hear at one point she has over 150 different citations in just the past year. So that, again, kind of plays into it. And then other factors that could be involved, they really look case by case at every single scenario before they assign any judication on a student or a youth.
Alright, I'm going to speak a little bit fast due to time, so please excuse me. So the government, obviously, throughout the story, we're seeing everything through Ananias's eyes instead of the government. So if we look through the government's eyes, some of what I'm saying may line up a little bit better, but this is currently what the government is trying to do in today's world. So there's basically 2 different things that the government does. They try to prevent, and then they try to treat and provide recovery for drug users. One of the programs for prevention is called Protecting Our Future. The main goal of Protecting Our Future is to resist young people from using drugs. And one of the main ways they do this is trying to prevent drugs getting onto the street. So they're trying to take away the drugs from the street, just as Marshall was talking about through the law enforcement aspect. A lot of the ways they plan to do this is to have different programs and agencies and communities come together, such as the overall government, national agencies, drug action teams, which is a field specifically developed just like our drug enforcement agency, the DEA, to combat drugs specifically, community representatives, National Health Service, Scotland's councils, volunteers, police, and the whole thing is to bring everybody together to create this one system that works fluently and really focuses on getting drugs off the street and to prevent people from using, especially the youth of Scotland. A lot of the programs, including Protecting Our Future, focuses on education, bettering current programs, as well as developing new, better programs. And most of the programs also have an emphasis on making sure that parents are somewhat involved, making sure that parents have the right education, have the right opportunities to bring their kids to services and rehabilitation centers and talks like Alcohol Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. So another program is Road to Recovery. What they do is, this program kind of broke it down into 3 separate users. They broke it down into experimenters, regular users, problem drug users. Experimenters are obviously people that do it once in a while. Regular users, a couple times a week. Problem, they're the ones like Anais that are out there doing stuff, stealing things off cop cars, yada yada yada.
You're at 32 minutes, so I need you to wrap up.
Okay. So Choice for Life, this one, I'm not going to load the website right now, but it's pretty cool. It shares stories, what the drugs can do to you, to your system, to your body, everything else. These are some of the treatment and recovery programs. Methadone treatments, different things that they can do to help everybody out on the street once they are drug users and addicts, how to get them. They focus on recovery and trying to recover their life in total, not just the drugs, their schoolwork, their job, their communication, their social atmosphere.
And then, just last thing, is that our thesis for this whole encompassing project was that basically that Fagan's novel accurately represented what we've been finding with our research through like the social system, the foster care system, drugs, and the drug culture, and basically that our thesis was supported throughout all of our research.
All right, thank you. Okay, so